Well, as we start in the book of James, it's worth asking, who is this person? Most likely to be Jesus' brother. James was a leader in the church in Jerusalem. His letter was mainly written for Jewish Christian house churches, and they would have been located outside of Jerusalem. Take that to be true because of the way he starts in verse 1, the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. And he's writing to Christians that are out there. As you can see, the red arrows show that's where people have been scattered toward. It wasn't like Paul, the church planter, travelling around all these different places. He was much more stationary in Jerusalem. And what is James concerned with? Well, one of the big themes that we see throughout the book is faith. What is a living faith? How does faith come alive, if you like, in our everyday? There's a lot about wisdom here. There's a lot about rich and poor. There's a lot about the tongue, how faith expresses itself through our words, and very much the connection between faith and our actions. That comes again and again in the book. Of course, this letter was written roughly 2,000 years ago, and yet it is the living, spirit-breathed word that still speaks to us today. So let's get into looking at verses 1 to 8 together. We're asking the question here, how can our faith thrive under trial? It's an absolutely critical question if we are to keep going with Jesus. Trials are often what draw people away from faith. They often kill faith. Therefore, it is so important that we are ready for them. If we want a living faith, we must be prepared, heart, mind, and soul, to combat trials. But what are trials? When you think about that, what could trials be? A trial could be maybe meeting opposition when we talk about Jesus, when we live for Jesus, maybe as we heard in Adam's story. A trial could be all sorts of things. It could be the loss of a loved one. It could be physical struggles, aches, pains and strains. It could be emotional or mental health struggle. It could be exhaustion. It could be relational fallouts. It could go on defining what a trial is. But wait a minute, you say. Hang on a second. Are we going a little bit far here? I thought these trials that we can see are just related to being a Christian. So picture with me someone in the office, perhaps, in the workplace, and they're talking about Jesus to their friend, and they get cold-shouldered for the next 6 months. I thought these trials were about, persecution for being a Christian. Well, as we think about that question, just look down with me at verse 2. Verse 2 says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." The word for pure there can literally mean all. Consider it all joy whenever you face trials of many kinds. Can you see what's happening there? James seems to be speaking in a broad kind of way. It could be the trials that come from being poor, because he talks about that a lot. It could be the trials of relational conflict, because that comes up in the letter as well later. Trials of many kinds. And what are your trials at the moment? What are the things on your mind at the moment? As well as suffering for sharing the gospel and being a Christian, there are so many things that fit into that category. And so we come to the million-dollar question. How can we thrive in our faith when we are under the trial? So often we wish that it would go away, don't we? We just wish that it would end. But what about when it's happening? They come thick and fast, and we need to know how to deal with them. Well, my first point is our faith can thrive when we know what our trials lead to. If you could advance the slide, that'd be great. By knowing what your trials lead to. Just look at verse 3. Let's start with verse 2. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Perseverance is about endurance. It's about patience. Just think of a weightlifter, perhaps, or a marathon runner. Every time they train, particularly a weightlifter, they damage their muscles. And as the muscles recover, they get a little bit stronger. Or every time a kind of marathon runner goes out on a jog, it's hard, isn't it? It's painful. But they're able to go that bit further. It's about discipline, pushing on towards a goal. And what is the kind of weightlifting here in this passage? Now, what are believers being encouraged to do? Well, consider it all joy. See, trials themselves, they're not joyful, are they? I don't think you need me to tell you that. They are the result of living in a broken world. They are a result of broken hearts. They're a result of the devil's work. Result of sin. But in those trials, James is saying that we need to learn to consider. God is actually disciplining us. He's training us through trials, and in them we are able to get a little bit stronger. Perseverance. That's what it produces. And you can listen to that and read it and think about it for a minute, and you might just think that sounds kind of insane. The hard things that come to, just consider it all joy. That just sounds a bit crazy, doesn't it? What planet are we living on? Well, just listen to these words from Hebrews 12 as we think about this. Hebrews 12, he says, "Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." So there we see the only possible way that we can radically consider trials as joy is by considering Christ, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, the greatest of trials. And of course it was the future that motivated him, as we see there. In dying and rising, he's saved us who believe in him, and now he transforms us to have the same outlook, the one that James is encouraging here. See, the marathon runner always has a goal before them, the finish line. And Jesus is the perfect model of perseverance for the joy set before him. So how can we possibly rejoice in trials? Well, Jesus is the source of our joy. He's the fountain of our joy. I don't know if you've met one of those people that is just so stubbornly joyful. My grandmother springs to mind when I say that. You know, life throws terrible things at them, loads of really difficult things, and they just refuse to stop being joyful. And my grandma lost her husband last year, but she has just remained joyful. It's staggering to me. You know, they just refuse to let any trial take their joy away. They look to Jesus and they always seem to find it, and it's real. There aren't loads of those kinds of people. And no doubt it's taken a lot of prayer, a lot of considering, a lot of training and discipline. Endure hardship as discipline, God says in Hebrews 12. And there's a sense, isn't there, that we need to work towards this and be active about it. You can see that in James 1 verse 4. He says, "Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. You see, those stubbornly joyful people have worked a lifetime at it. As athletes press towards their goal, so we press on towards a goal. Or you can picture a sculptor who's chipping away at the piece of stone. And they keep going, don't they? It takes a long time and skill and hard work, but finally it becomes beautiful. And you can stand back and marvel. So every time you consider a trial as joy, you're moving on towards this sense of completion that he's talking about here. Maturity, not lacking anything. That's the first part to faith thriving under trial. What about the second? Let's move on to our second point. Our faith can thrive by praying for wisdom. Look at verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. What does wisdom conjure up in your mind? Perhaps it's someone with a long beard on a mountain somewhere, and they're kind of ancient oracles of wisdom that have been passed down through generations. Or maybe immediately you go to Proverbs. That's where nuggets of wisdom are found in God's word, or perhaps the most commonplace. Well, the original word for wisdom is Sophia, and the word is about wisdom of a practical nature. James defines true wisdom later on in 3:13. He says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. So this wisdom is knowledge for upright living, for godly living. We know that God has supreme wisdom. Jesus himself is described as wisdom in the Bible. And it says here in James 1 that if we ask the one who has supreme wisdom, who is supreme wisdom, then he will give it generously. It's quite amazing, really. He doesn't keep the wisdom to himself, doesn't hold on to it, but wants to give it generously. You think of King Solomon when you think of wisdom. God gave him the opportunity of a lifetime. Ask me for whatever you want and I'm going to give it to you. What would you go for? Could have had lots of money. Could have been the most powerful man in the world. But he goes for wisdom, a discerning heart to govern and distinguish between right and wrong. So coming back to our question, how can faith thrive under trial? Firstly, we consider trials all joy because Jesus is the source of our joy. And then we ask for wisdom. Here's a diagram to help picture this on the next slide. So the intensity of trials come. We must be pushed towards God and ask for help. That's the idea. What do I do in this situation? What do I do when it's going wrong? What do I do when it's not going the way that I planned it to go? I go to God. I ask for wisdom. I pray. We need God's help. We must seek it. But it's not necessarily automatic. We've got to pray. We've got to go. I don't know if you've ever lacked or felt as though you've lacked wisdom when life's been difficult. I think everyone could put their hands up at that, couldn't they? Well, the only qualification here that you need is neediness. God is generous. He gives to all without finding fault, verse 5. He's not waiting to trip you up, in other words. He's not looking at your record to find some kind of misbehavior so that he can then keep his wisdom to himself. No, he wants to give it generously. So go to him and ask. You know, sometimes it's just not straightforward when we've got a situation. We know what the Bible says, it's clear here, but this situation is very difficult. And that's when we need wisdom, isn't it? That's when we need to pray and pray again. He gives generously to all without finding fault. No one disqualified. What an encouragement. What an amazing promise for us this evening. one to write down and stick somewhere. But there is actually one condition to this wisdom, and that's our final points. If we can move on, that would be great. So our faith thrives under trial when we ask for wisdom, but we must ask single-mindedly. Look at verse 6. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. If you could go to the next slide, as I was referring to earlier, here's a picture of a wave in the middle of the storm. When we think of waves, you might think of on the shore, kind of breaking on the sand. But James is talking about a wave that is in the middle of the ocean in a storm. It's changing form and shape all the time, kind of foaming and spraying. There's loads of fluctuations to its structure every second. It's going in all kinds of directions. When it comes to prayer, asking God for wisdom, some of us can be a bit like a wave. Change directions all the time. And the word for doubt here in verse 6 has the sense of a kind of a willful dividing of what should be joined together. And I think this word doesn't mean we're slightly askew from belief, but it's more than that. It's the opposite of belief, I think. It's a bit like a car that is going in one direction and then turns round and then turns round, changes directions. You know, on Monday we think that God's like this, on Tuesday we think God's like that. There's no consistency in the asking and the view of who God is, just changing all the time. In Matthew 21, Jesus curses a fig tree and it withers immediately, and his disciples are amazed at this. And they say, how did you do that? Now Jesus says to them, truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what was done to the fig tree, but also you can say to this mountain, go, throw yourself into the sea, and it will be done. If you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer. Now, before you go talking to a mountain or a fig tree, I think Jesus' point here is that we need to be single-minded in our asking for things. If we're asking for something that lines up with God's will and we're doing it single-mindedly, then we will receive, I think is the promise. But we can't be in this constant dispute. We can't be double-minded, says James. That kind of person is unstable, and not just in their prayer life, but in the rest of their life as well, verse 8, in all that they do. And once we understand who God is, the fact he made the world, the way that he made me, he's sovereign over the world, he's good. Once we've got those things, then we need to come to our unchanging God, knowing that he will be consistent in all of his ways. You see, true faith trusts in the true God, the one consistent God. We're trying to teach Florence and Otis, have been for a long time, to come to us if they've got a problem. Very often, if they're having some kind of squabble or something, the results are hitting or shouting or something like that. We're trying to teach them, if it goes wrong, then come to mummy and daddy and tell us about the problem first, and then we'll be able to help you. Rather than resorting to anything else, come and ask us for help. And we're always going to say yes, aren't we? If you come and ask us for help, we're always going to say yes and help you. And I think it's similar for us, isn't it, with God? In times of trial, we ask God for wisdom. We do it single-mindedly, knowing who he is, knowing that we will receive. I wonder if you believe that. Can't go on thinking that it's 50-50. So you ask and believe. So stepping back and summing this up, what are your trials at the moment? Let me just bring them to mind. Maybe that doesn't take long. Maybe you feel weighed down by them. Well, firstly, I think James says, come to Jesus. Talk to him about the trial. Consider him who's been through the worst of trials. And then consider your trial as joy in the light of all of that. Knowing that you've got this eternal future with Jesus and is producing perseverance in you. Work out that muscle if you like. And then pray. Ask for wisdom. Do it single-mindedly. And then I hope you'd see an impact on you, the way that you are. Perhaps the way that you are with your family and friends, the way you are with your church, the way you are in all of life, as you stubbornly consider these trials as joy. Don't constantly double take on God. God, He is good. He will provide wisdom for you. So take Him at His word, what He's said here. Well, we're going to finish by singing.